What do you call a prime minister who's so rattled by the opposition that he launches into a furious rant on national television? Desperate. Keir Starmer just went on GB News and absolutely tore into Nigel Farage, accusing him of peddling falsehoods and saying slippery things that don't stand up to scrutiny. Now, you might think, well, that's just normal political sparring. Politicians attack each other all the time. Except here's the twist. Reform UK is leading in the national polls. They're projected to win 381 seats if there was an election today. 381 seats. That's not a political party. That's a political tsunami. And Starmer knows it. So instead of talking about his own achievements, which, let's be honest, would be a very short conversation, he's attacking Farage. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, where we break down the political chaos and make sense of the madness. Let's dive into why Starmer is panicking and whether his attack on Farage holds any water. So the scene is set. Starmer's doing an interview with GB News, and he gets asked what his message is for people who think Nigel Farage would make a better prime minister. Now, that's already a brutal question, because the implication is that a significant number of people do think Farage would be better. And based on the polling, they're not wrong to think that way. But instead of pivoting to his own strengths, instead of explaining what Labour is doing well, Starmer goes straight for the jugular. He says, well, my message would be that Nigel Farage says a lot of things that aren't true and don't come to fruition. And then he launches into a list of Brexit promises that allegedly didn't pan out. Let's break down Starmer's accusations because they're fascinating. First, he says Farage stood in front of voters during the Brexit referendum and said if we leave the EU, migration will come down. Well, it didn't come down, it quadrupled, the Boris Johnson wave. Okay, so let's fact-check the fact-checker. It's true that migration increased after Brexit. In fact, net migration hit record highs under the Conservative government. But here's a nuance that Starmer conveniently glosses over. Farage in the Brexit campaign talked about controlling immigration, specifically EU immigration. And EU immigration did come down. What went up was non-EU immigration, which was always under the control of the UK government. So when Starmer blames this on Brexit, he's being a bit disingenuous. The UK government chose to increase non-EU migration. That's a policy choice, not a Brexit consequence. But sure, let's blame Farage for decisions made by Boris Johnson and subsequent governments. That makes total sense. Next, Starmer brings up the infamous £350 million a week for the NHS claim. He says Farage said if we leave the EU, you'd have £350 million a week for the NHS. That didn't turn out to be the case. Now, this is where things get interesting, because Starmer is misattributing this claim. The $350 million a week figure was on the side of the Vote Leave bus. Vote Leave was the official Brexit campaign, led by Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, and Dominic Cummings. Farage was not part of Vote Leave. He ran a separate campaign called Leave.eu. So Starmer is literally blaming Farage for something Boris Johnson's campaign said. That's like blaming Ed Sheeran for a bad One Direction song. They're both British musicians, but they're completely separate entities. Either Starmer doesn't know this, which would be embarrassing for a prime minister, or he does know it and he's deliberately misleading people. Neither option is a good look. Then Starmer says Farage claimed that leaving the EU would cut lots of red tape. Try telling that to anyone who is dealing and doing business with the EU. Again, there's a kernel of truth wrapped in a misleading narrative. Brexit did create additional red tape for businesses trading with the EU, because now there are customs checks and regulatory divergence. That's undeniable. But the argument from Brexit supporters was that the UK would have more control over its own regulations and could cut red tape domestically. Whether that's happened is debatable and depends on which sector you're looking at. But to present it as a flat-out lie requires ignoring the nuance of what was actually promised versus what's been implemented. But nuance doesn't make for good attack lines, so Starmer skips it entirely. Starmer concludes his rant by saying, so what you get with Nigel Farage is a lot of slippery things that are said, but when you hold them up to the light, they're not actually true. And peddling falsehoods is no way to solve the problems of this country. Slippery things. That's a very careful choice of words. Not lies, not deceptions, slippery things. It's like he wanted to call Farage a liar, but his lawyers told him not to. So we get slippery things instead. And then the kicker. Peddling falsehoods is no way to solve the problems of this country, which is rich coming from a man who promised not to raise taxes on working people and then hiked national insurance contributions in his first budget. But I digress. Here's what's really going on. Starmer is terrified, and he should be, because the numbers are genuinely shocking. New research by More and Common, which polled 16,000 Britons, found that Reform UK would win 381 seats if there was a general election now. To put that in perspective, you need 326 seats for a majority in the House of Commons. Reform would have a comfortable majority with 55 seats to spare. Labour, who currently have a massive majority, would be decimated. The Conservatives would be annihilated. This would be the biggest political upheaval in modern British history. It would make 1997 look like a minor adjustment. And Farage knows it. That's why Reform has pledged to launch a £5 million spending blitz ahead of May's local elections. They're going for the kill. The local elections in May are going to be a bloodbath for Labour. Elections for the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Parliament, and English councils are all happening. And based on current sentiment, Labour is going to get hammered. Starmer knows this. That's why he's out here attacking Farage instead of defending his own record. Because his record is indefensible. The economy is stagnant, the cost of living crisis continues, immigration is still high, public services are struggling. What exactly is Starmer supposed to brag about? So instead, he goes negative. He tries to tear down Farage in the hope that people will think, well, maybe Starmer is not great, but at least he's better than that liar Farage. Except there are two problems with this strategy. First, it's not working. The polls show Reform is surfing. Second, it makes Starmer look weak. Strong leaders talk about what they're doing. Weak leaders talk about why the other guy is worse. Let's talk about Nigel Farage for a second, because he's the most fascinating figure in British politics right now. Love him or hate him, and trust me, people have strong opinions, you cannot deny that he's effective. He took UKIP from a French party to a force that triggered the Brexit referendum. Then he joined Reform UK and has turned it into a genuine threat to both Labour and the Conservatives. He's a master communicator. He understands media. He knows how to tap into public frustration. And right now, there is a lot of public frustration to tap into. People are angry about immigration. They're angry about the economy. They're angry about politicians who promise change and deliver more of the same. Farage gives them someone to vote for who isn't part of the establishment. Whether his policies would actually work is almost beside the point. He represents change, and right now, change sounds pretty appealing. Now, Starmer's criticism of Farage's Brexit promises is interesting because it reveals Starmer's strategy. He's trying to remind people that Farage has made promises before that didn't come true. Therefore, you shouldn't trust him now. It's a valid tactic in theory, except it requires people to blame Farage for things that arguably weren't his fault or weren't even his promises in the first place. The $350 million for the NHS was Boris Johnson's lie, not Farage's. The quadrupling of immigration happened under Conservative governments who chose to increase non-EU migration. Yes, Farage campaigned for Brexit, but he wasn't in government making policy decisions afterward, so trying to hold him responsible for how Brexit was implemented is a stretch. But here's where Starmer's attack might actually have some merit. Farage does say things that are provocative, sometimes misleading, and often oversimplified. That's his brand. He speaks in sound bites. He gives simple answers to complex questions. Does that mean he's peddling falsehoods? Sometimes yes. But you know who else does that? Every politician, Starmer included. The difference is Farage is better at it and people are more willing to believe him because they're so fed up with the mainstream establishment politicians who've let them down. The real question is, why are people turning to Reform in such massive numbers? And the answer isn't because Farage is a silver-tongued deceiver who's tricked everyone. It's because the mainstream parties have failed. Labour and the Conservatives have both had their chance to govern and both have disappointed. People want something different. They want someone who will actually address immigration, who will actually improve the economy, who will actually make their lives better. Farage promises to do that. Whether he could deliver is unknown because he's never been in government. But at this point, people are willing to roll the dice on the unknown rather than stick with the known failures. Starmer's attack on Farage also reveals something else. He's worried about the May elections. He mentioned that pressure will increase on him if there are bad results for Labour in Scotland, Wales, and English councils. That's a massive understatement. If Labour gets crushed in May, which seems likely, there will be renewed calls for a leadership challenge. Starmer is already fending off rumbles from his own backbenchers. A disastrous showing in May could be the final straw, and he knows it. That's why he's trying to undercut Reform now, before the elections. He's trying to convince voters not to use the local elections as a protest vote against Labour by reminding them that Farage can't be trusted. Except there's a problem with that strategy. When you're the one in power and things are going badly, telling people not to vote for the alternative because they can't be trusted doesn't work, because people look around at their lives, see that things aren't improving under your leadership, and think, well, it can't get much worse, can it? Might as well try something different. That's the logic that brought Brexit, that brought Trump, that brings populist movements everywhere. It's not that people necessarily believe the populace will fix everything, it's that they know the current law definitely won't. Let's also address the elephant in the room. Starmer calling anyone slippery is peak irony. This is a man who has U-turned on virtually every position he held during the Labour leadership campaign. He promised not to raise taxes on working people, then did. He said he'd make the UK the fastest growing economy in the G7. It's not. He pledged to fix the NHS. It's still in crisis. He's broken promise after promise. So for him to stand there and accuse Farage of saying things that don't come to fruition requires a level of self-awareness so low it's actually impressive. It's like being lectured on honesty by a used car salesman. You